Hello everyone. It's great to see you all again. I think I missed last month, didn't I? So it's great to be back. Firstly, I want to thank our people who provided us the venue and let us use their office. Michael and Chris at Capital One. I don't know where Chris has run up to. Oh, there we are. Thank you very much. We've been here for close to a year now, isn't it? So we've been here. It's been a while. I've been here. So yeah. So really happy to have this venue. It's fantastic, and yeah, we wouldn't be around if you weren't here. So thank you to them, and also our sponsors for beer and pizza, Cordius. Thank you also to you. I think Alex, would you like to come and say a quick few words about Cordius?
Yeah, just very quickly. Hi everyone. For people that don't know who we are, I'm Alex. I'm from Cordius. Cordius IT technical recruiters based in Derby. We work predominantly across the East Midlands, and we try and get out and actually speak to a lot of you guys so we can help as much as we can do in terms of finding you new roles or helping you recruit. So if you're looking to recruit or you're looking for a new role, feel free to come and have a chat with me and Zach over there. So we'll be quiet and try and understand what you guys are going on about. So, thank you very much.
Cool. So I'll get started then, I guess. So I'm Sean. I work at a company called PCA Predict down in Worcester. You might be able to tell from my accent, I'm actually recently moved over here from Australia, so still kind of getting used to the countryside. I've actually wanted to come to Nottingham for a long time, so it was a good chance to kind of come up and see the place. Got a couple of hours of daylight in, which was nice. And I'll be talking about Aurelia today, which is really cool, kind of relatively new front-end framework, kind of headed up by Rob Eisenberg. So the agenda is roughly, we're going to kind of go through a bit of the backstory of where JavaScript has kind of come from over the past few years, which will kind of set the stage for why Aurelia has kind of come about the way that it has. And the funny thing is, a lot of the front-end frameworks, you know, React, Angular, Angular 2, and Ember, and Aurelia are kind of headed in a similar direction. And a lot of these things like ES 2015, the focus on component-driven development and things like that are kind of central to all of them. So that'll kind of set the stage for Aurelia. I'll then give you a bit of an introduction to Aurelia. We'll kind of go through the basics of the framework that should give you what you need to kind of get started, get a basic app up and running. We won't have time to go into the advanced aspects, but if you've got any questions on more advanced topics, just feel free to shout out at any time. That's one thing I like to encourage. So I like the talks to be kind of as interactive as possible. So if you've got a question, just kind of, you know, shout it out or raise your hand at any point. Don't bother waiting till the end because you'll probably have forgotten it. I know I forget questions by the end, so just raise your hand. Yeah, we've been using Aurelia for the past kind of, I guess, 4 months now in production, or in dev to start off with. Recently past kind of 3 months in production, and so kind of go through kind of the good things, but also some of the kind of, I guess, teething issues that we've had on moving to Aurelia in production as well. So throughout the talk, I'm going to focus on 4 main themes. So these are the themes that I look for kind of when I'm looking at front-end frameworks in general. And so I want the framework firstly to be composable. So there's this emphasis these days on kind of component-driven development. There's a lot of different ways of creating these components. You could, you know, use Angular and create directives. You could use Polymer and create, you know, Polymer components. There's this idea of shifting from having these monolithic, you know, UIs to having these little chunks of UI that we can then kind of build together in lots of different ways that allow us to be a lot more agile in the way that we build our user interfaces. So I want a framework that kind of allows me to do that and doesn't kind of get in the way of that. We want something that's forward-thinking. So JavaScript moves kind of really fast. And we want something that is going to kind of take advantage of that. And kind of Aurelia fits into that category nicely. We want something that's going to be simple for developers to pick up. So we're in a kind of a world right now where you're not necessarily going to be able to have one framework and just use it for everything. It's not like the old days of, you install Visual Studio, you use, web forms or whatever comes out of the box, and that's the standard. It's basically, there's going to be different frameworks used. At my old place, we used kind of a mixture of Backbone, then we had some Angular, whole different array of different things. So we don't want the burden to be too great of adopting new frameworks. We want it to be kind of nice and simple and easy for people to pick up. And also with that, we want flexibility. So a lot of frameworks are easy enough when you go down the kind of the main path that the framework authors kind of thought about. But as soon as you try and break off that path, you run into a whole heap of issues, or it takes a lot more time, and you have to kind of do research to figure out how things work. So, or in the worst case, you might not be able to get the framework to do that at all. So Aurelia kind of has a focus on having simple conventions that work like you would want out of the box, or like most people would want 80% of the time, with the ability to then go and kind of hook into the framework and change those conventions to suit the way that you want the framework to work. So a brief history, I promise I'll keep it relatively brief, of where we've kind of been over the past few years, and then so we can see kind of why Aurelia has developed the way it has, and where it fits into the picture. So initially we had jQuery back in around 2009. What I loved about jQuery was the ability to kind of start doing cross-browser development a lot more easily. And this started that shift from, it's like we're just maybe doing JavaScript for some form validations or on-click handlers and things like that, to actually starting to put some nice clean widgets on the UI, so autocompletes and things like that. So more code started to kind of shift into the front end that was kind of maybe traditionally done on the back end. That kind of led into a lot of problems though, because jQuery didn't really specify a way to structure that code. So we ended up with kind of callback hell and a lot of mess, really tangled code that was kind of really hard to work through. So at that point, a lot of people at the same time tried to start thinking about better ways of doing things. And that's where we got the next kind of iteration of these, or the first real iteration of the single page app frameworks. So we had things like Knockout, which is in a way quite similar to the way Aurelia works. It's an MVVM kind of framework. And on the other side, Backbone.js, which was kind of popular across the board, but kind of came from the Ruby camp initially. And that was great. It allowed us a way of kind of starting to split this code into manageable chunks, and just made it a lot easier to reason about. My team were using Backbone for our first app at a previous company. We kind of had a hybrid model of MVC on the back end, with kind of certain sections of the app that we wanted to make richer, like maybe a shopping cart or things like that, done in Backbone to add that kind of richness to the UI, which was good. It helped a lot, but then we kind of ran into more problems. So Backbone is event driven, which means that basically everything that happens in the UI or everything that happens in the app is driven by events. which means that while you're writing it and you've got all of that context loaded up into your head, it makes a lot of sense and it's really easy to work with. But then a developer comes on 6 months later and tries to fix a bug. They have no idea where to start. So it might take them like days to kind of trace it back and figure out what's going on. So, and it also, the initial frameworks weren't really as fully featured as what we'd like. They had kind of rudimentary routing and things like that, but they weren't necessarily as easy to use as they could have been. So a lot of people, when they started writing single-page apps, didn't handle kind of routing and things like that. So users would have this app where they'd click around for maybe half an hour and then click the back button, and all of a sudden their state is completely lost and they don't know where they are. So we need something kind of a little bit more powerful than that. So that's where we kind of moved on to Angular at that point. Angular, funnily enough, it came out a lot earlier than what I thought. I think it was around 2009 or something, but it really had an explosion in around kind of 2013. And that was kind of great. It gave us this routing, really powerful router to do kind of sub-routes and things like that. So got out of that issue of having to deal with, users having to deal with hitting the back button and losing their state. Directives, so that's kind of brought, for me, that was the first introduction to this component-based development, this idea of kind of sharding up the UI, and also kind of two-way data binding. Angular did it in a way that was perhaps not the best, though Angular 1 that is, in that they use dirty checking, which basically has a loop running in the back end constantly scanning for changes, which means that if you're not careful what you're doing, you can end up with a lot of performance issues. Experienced Angular developers will know that those are there, and they'll kind of work around them. But as a new developer coming onto the team, that can be, a little bit of a way to shoot yourself into the foot. And so you want a framework, and I think Angular 2 does a lot better job of this as well, that is going to kind of work in a performant way out of the box, and only kind of lean towards things like dirty checking that are going to cause performance problems when there's nothing else that you can possibly do. So there's a lot of stuff kind of coming up. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, ES kind of 2015 and beyond with JavaScript modules, decorators. There's a lot of cool language features that are coming out now, and really a lot of the framework authors are starting to look at those and go, well, how can we kind of slim down our frameworks to take advantage of these new features? And having these new features, the frameworks can kind of be a lot different and actually a lot nicer to use than what we had in the past few years. Yeah.
Yes.
So, sorry, ECMAScript 2015. So I think it's because JavaScript is, the word JavaScript is like trademarked. The standards committee wanted a kind of a standard way of referring to it that wasn't trademarked. So hence it's called ES 2015 or ECMAScript 2015 these days. Initially I had to stop myself from calling it JavaScript because there's always one person in the audience that goes, it's called ES now. So yeah, now I've gone the other way. So I should really be saying ECMAScript because most people, or a lot of people still, calling it JavaScript, which makes a lot more sense to me, to be honest. The first thing that, there's a bunch of things that you kind of need to understand in order to work effectively with Aurelia. And not just with Aurelia, with a lot of these new frameworks. There's a bunch of kind of tools that you need to kind of understand to be able to work with them. They make the development process easier when you're up and running, but there can be a bit of a learning curve when you're getting started. But the first of these is JSPM. What it is I say frictionless browser package management, it's not frictionless. It's a little bit less friction than what you would have. So basically what it is, it's a combination of, say, the NPM repository and Bower, and also a module loader like ReactJS. So what it allows you to do is pull in different JavaScript components like Lodash or different UI widgets and things like that using the command line, and then basically import those components into your different JavaScript classes in a pretty kind of easy and standardized way. It's actually built on top of the ES6 module loader, which means that it's based on the JavaScript standard. So and that's something that's kind of a common theme in Aurelia, where they can use the standard stuff. They try to do that, which makes it really easy to interoperate with lots of different libraries and things. So with JSPM, I mentioned that we're pulling in potentially JavaScript modules, and these are things like CommonJS formatted node modules. And why do we want to do that to start off with? Why can't we just include scripts in our pages? And Scott Allen, I was listening to a podcast or something with him on it recently, and he basically said, with this version of JavaScript, we should start thinking about modules as opposed to script files. And it's it sounds simple, but it really fundamentally changes the way that we think about things. So a lot of people will have already been splitting their JavaScript up into classes or modules. If you're using TypeScript, you're probably doing a lot of that anyway. But it's this idea of, we start working with JavaScript like it's a proper language, not just a scripting language where we're including a bunch of script files in the page and potentially having collisions and things like that. So just a lot neater way of working with JavaScript. So we've had a way of doing modules for a while in JavaScript. This, to kind of an experienced JavaScript developer, is what they see all day long. So it makes a lot of sense. But it's a immediately executed function. But to someone that's novice, I know when I started with JavaScript, I didn't know what on earth this was. I had to go and look it up. So for something as simple as creating a class that exports some functions, you shouldn't need to do that, in my opinion. So forgive the squigglies. VS Code doesn't support this syntax yet. But basically, this is how we do the same thing with JavaScript modules. So the old way versus the new way. It's just a lot simpler way. We can export functions or we can export classes. And so it's starting to look a lot more like a proper programming language. JavaScript purists would probably be angry at me for saying that. But for me, that looks a lot nicer. So I'll kind of go through a demo of JSPM now. Okay, and that should spin up. Eventually. There we go. Okay, so this is a really simple, you notice the EPUB book there, that's actually a book on Aurelia, so it's a good reference that I'll kind of link to you guys a bit later on. But what you'll see here in the network tab, res isn't ideal for it. I'll reload that page. changing, so that's the output. I'll switch over to the code now to kind of show you how that's put together. And what we can see here, yeah, that's enough to be able to see it. Okay, so basically what we've got here is the include of system.js, which is the module loader. That's the thing that's going to go and basically grab the JavaScript files and actually include them. And then the config.js, which basically tells system.js where to find the files on disk. So when you install a module with JSPM, it will get basically added to this config file. Typically, you won't have to look into this. It's only if something kind of goes wrong and you're kind of not getting the module loaded up correctly that you need to dive in here. So this is basically a mapping of names that you'll basically include into your JavaScript classes to where to find them on disk. And here we see our app, which is just a simple JavaScript module. So it's importing a function called getStatus from the status module. And if we follow that down one level, we've got this getStatus function being exported. So the reason that I'm going through this is basically what ECMAScript 2015 or this is what the current version of Java or the next version of JavaScript looks like. This is what it looks like when we create our JavaScript classes. And the reason that's important is because Aurelia basically tries to get out of our way as much as possible so that we're just writing these kind of simple JavaScript classes and with as little without the framework getting in our way. So switching back. You always run into issues switching between presentation mode and non-presentation mode. Okay, cool. That was relatively smooth for a JavaScript demo. So that's our JavaScript module. Any questions on JavaScript modules at this point? Because it's something that's fairly new. Has anyone used ReactJS before? Yeah. Oh, cool. So there's a bit of understanding of that. So yeah, if you're familiar with ReactJS, this is pretty much the same thing. Okay, so how we've seen kind of some stuff that doesn't look like standard JavaScript. So how do we use that in our current environments in browsers that don't necessarily support it yet? So this kind of leads on to the idea of instead of working with just native JavaScript now, most of the time we'll be transpiling it from something else. So whether that's kind of TypeScript, which Aurelia supports as well, or or whether it's CoffeeScript, or whether it's AS 2015, there's this shift towards kind of working in some kind of higher level language that has more constructs that make our lives easier, and then transpiling it down to ES5, which is supported by the browser. So my workflow with Aurelia is to basically start with the ES 2015 classes, transpile it with the Babel preprocessor. You've got the other option of Tracor, but I haven't worked with that. So my experience is Babel's been pretty easy to work with. And out of interest, who's using some kind of a build process, be it Gulp or Grunt or something like that? Oh, that's good. Yeah, so we've got a really modern web development audience today, so it's good. Get kind of a mix, and it's interesting because giving this talk even kind of say 5 months ago, there was a lot less people that were kind of doing these kind of modern web development practices. So it just kind of goes to show how quickly this space is moving. So yeah, basically the way that I work is I've got it set up as a part of my gulp pipeline. So transpile the ES 2015 down into ES5, add the source maps and what have you, and then I've got something that I can work with in the browser. Okay, and there's some cool stuff in ES 2015 that people in TypeScript will probably not really care too much about because they've already had it for a while, but things like arrow functions, decorators, modules, and properties. We'll go through each of those in a little bit of detail. So arrow functions, they kind of look like a C# lambda. It just prevents us having to write, these big function declarations everywhere, and allows us to declare a function in a much more terse way. So you're going to see a lot of that in the Aurelia kind of sample code. The decorators, so these are basically they're kind of like the way that attributes work in C#. And predominantly these are for where you need to, they're used in Aurelia for where you need to override the default conventions. So in this case, we're overriding the default convention. We're going between views and view models. So I'll go into that in a bit more detail later, but this is basically saying we've got an attribute up the top here, or a decorator that's saying that there's no view, telling Aurelia not to look for a view associated with that view model class. So now finally, I've taken you kind of through this journey of JavaScript over the past few years and all this new stuff that's coming up. And that's where kind of Aurelia comes in. So Aurelia takes advantage of all these things that I've been talking about over the last kind of 15 minutes to kind of give you a framework that does everything that you would expect of a modern framework, but does it in a way that kind of doesn't have a lot of extra framework weight. So most of the time you're just writing pure JavaScript and just adding a bit of framework code here and there where needed for things like data binding. Got sound effects there.
Sorry.
We've got, it would be better if I had a point to make when the sound effect went off. I think it would be nice to have one of those like pedals like I have with guitar, so I could just like do explosions or something like that when I make a good point. Yeah, drum roll or something like that. Would be quite handy, but alas, I don't have anything like that. So Aurelia uses the MVVM pattern. That's the model view model. Try to say that 5 times fast. It's a bit of a tongue twister, but it kind of came out of the WPF Silverlight days of desktop app development. And it's this idea of separation of concerns between the view and which is our display of the data versus the view model, which is where our behavior sits. And this is kind of, I could leave now, I won't, but if I could leave now and just seeing this, you would be able to develop an Aurelia application quite comfortably. You'd install the sample app, which I'll show you later, and 90% of what you're doing on a day-to-day basis with Aurelia is you creating a view model class. I typically create the view model first, then create the view, but it doesn't matter which way you do it. And then create the corresponding view class. It's really simple, but once you start you can really build your UI up out of these view model pairs. So, and it can go to kind of any level. And it's similar to the way with React of kind of building these components, and then you have components within components within components. So you do a similar thing with Aurelia. So here on the left, we're seeing the view, which is using the first binding syntax, which I'll go into a little bit more detail later. But that's the standard template string interpolation syntax for that's kind of in the web standards coming out. So Rob Eisenberg, the framework author, has kind of taken that standard and used it as a binding syntax to display what's a property, the contents of a property in the view model, in this case the heading. So that's the basics of what you're doing with Aurelia. And now the next thing I'll do is kind of jump into a bit of a demo application. All the code from this demo is developed by the kind of Aurelia team. So it's available on GitHub. The nice thing about this is that each time they do make changes to the framework, which they're doing all the time, particularly at the moment because it's, I think, still in RC, they'll go and modify all of their sample code to reflect the new way of doing things. So it's their GitHub page is a really good thing really good resource to be aware of, because there's a lot of stuff on there that you can kind of refer back to kind of help you along your way. So just exit this for now, and okay, that's good. We've got a better resolution now, so you can actually see what I'm showing you. I don't know why PowerPoint has suddenly gone to a little pint-sized version, but I'll jump over to my next demo. Okay, so because it's a JavaScript framework, it's kind of obligatory that I show you a to-do list example. So you can do a to-do list with Aurelia, funnily enough. What we've got here is a few kind of, it's a really simple example, but there's a few aspects of the framework that are kind of highlighted. So the first thing that we've got is some data binding. So as we check the option here, we're binding that to the value in a list to kind of do some work on what's being displayed in that table. We've also got what's called value converters applying here, so that we can filter down what's shown in the list as we type. So really simple example, but kind of shows a few of the features of Aurelia off. Another example here is, this is another value converter. So we're taking the ES date, which would normally look like a woeful kind of string that's really hard to read, and making it readable. So that's something that you would use, I think they're called filters in Angular for, and you can do that with Aurelia as well. And I'll kind of go through that in a bit more detail later. So we'll jump into the code for that. Okay, so this is where I was a bit brave, referencing resources from a CDN. I don't think I've got internet at the moment, so I do somehow. So the cloud. So the cloud has come to the rescue and provided me my CSS. because otherwise you would have seen a pretty poor-looking UI. So that was quite handy. So you'll see here that this is actually pretty much exactly what we saw for the JSPM example. So we're including System.js, which is going to allow us to bootstrap all of our modules, including Aurelia, and then the config file, and then we're importing the Aurelia bootstrapper, which is going to basically spin up our app. There's not much Aurelia code in here. The only thing that we've got here is an Aurelia custom attribute, which is basically defining that the Aurelia app is going to be injected into that div. So outside of that div, we're in normal web land. Inside of that div, we're in Aurelia land, similar to the ng app or whatever the equivalent in Angular is. So you're basically specifying that's where you want your app to start. Kind of going down to the next level, the app.html file. So in this example, it's pretty much the most basic example that we could do. So we've just got a single view, which is this file here, and most of this is really just plain HTML. It's actually using the template standard. So I was talking before about custom or web components. So this is one of the elements of the web component standard. Writing web components in Polymer.js, which is the component framework from Google, you would do a similar thing. So from there, we're using the require custom element, which I'll go through what a custom element is in a little bit more detail later, to import two external dependencies. And then going down, we'll look at some simple data binding first. So going into this here, so this is where we're seeing kind of all of those items stamped out here. So how we're actually doing that is we've got a repeat, which is basically a custom attribute provided by the Aurelia framework, repeating over all of those items. We've then got a value converter to allow us to do that searching or filtering down of the list. I'll go through value converters in a little bit. But then we've got our first simple data binding example. So this is using that simple string interpolation. Whenever you see that binding syntax, it means that something's coming one way from the view model up into the view. If you've used any ES 2015 before, this should look fairly familiar because it's pretty much, it's very similar to the string interpolation syntax in ES 2015. So that's kind of where they got that idea from. The repeat.for, that's an example of kind of the simple conventions that Aurelia, the Aurelia team try to make sure they put in place with everything they do. Pretty much what I found when I'm developing Aurelia apps is that you can guess what the syntax will be 90% of the time and put it in, and most of the time you'll be almost right, and then you're close enough that you can just Google it and you'll get it. But in this example, repeat.for is pretty kind of intuitive, easy to remember. We've got a binding, another binding on the checkbox there. So if we go in here, that's this checkbox here. So as we're clicking that, that's firing the data binding. This is the second type of binding that we've got available to us in Aurelia. So the Aurelia data binding system works in this way. By default, it's going to do one-way data binding on everything except for input elements, which kind of makes sense, right? You only want to basically send the data back if you got an input element that you're using to kind of enter data into the form. So that's kind of done for performance reasons. So what I said before about this dirty checking with Angular and kind of other previous frameworks, it's not needed a lot of the time in Aurelia because by default you're doing one-way data binding, and a lot of the time with the standard elements they don't need to do dirty checking because they've got other ways of determining when things have changed. So that's the second example of data binding. If we wanted to change this to be explicit two-way data binding, we could just do that. So this basically says always do two-way data binding. In this case, we don't need to do it because Aurelia is going to pick that up as a default convention. But if we want to be explicit, we can do that. The recommendation is to not do that unless you've kind of changed the way the conventions are working. You can also do the other way and do a one-way data binding explicitly. So I'll back that out. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of Aurelia data binding. The only other thing you kind of need to think about with Aurelia data binding is that when you're doing things that have kind of calculated values, so say you had a full name property that was a concatenation of the first name and the last name, that's going to require out-of-the-box dirty checking to determine what the value of that should be in case it's changed in the view model behind the scenes. So it will constantly be scanning that to check what's changed to display it on the UI. There's some syntax which I'll show you later which allows you to basically declare that as a dependency property based on two different values, so the first name and the last name. So out of the box, you don't need to care about those things most of the time, but if we have some time later, I'll go through some of the kind of performance hacks you can go through if you need the app to perform like really fast. Is there any questions on data binding at this point? Yep.
Could you use that dot bind on any attribute?
Yeah, so you can use it on basically any attribute that you want, and that's kind of the beauty of it is that it's kind of it's a simple convention. So basically, and that's the way it works with most of the things at Aurelia, is that if it works that way in one place, it probably works the same way everywhere across the framework. So you can do that. You can also, a lot of the time, you don't even need to use the dot bind. So if I wanted to say apply a class to here, if I wanted to make the row fancy, I could apply my fancy class just using the string interpolation syntax. So what I find is the majority of the time when I'm doing kind of things that are just one way for display purposes, I'm using the string interpolation stuff. And this is really handy, particularly on classes. I find that's one of the most common kind of data bindings that I do, is just to display things, depending on what the status of a particular object is or something like that, just tweaking the class that's displayed. And then just mainly using the bind syntax for if I'm using like an input element or checkbox or something like that, is generally the convention that I follow. Like if I had, same thing, if I had like if I wanted to bind this heading, so if we, as an example, take away this, because we don't have a fancy class to apply. I'm not fancy enough. So back here, if we go okay, so we're now setting a bindable property on the view model. And remember what that's called, heading. So we can do one-way data binding to basically just render that straight out there. And I was being brave before and it worked well for me up until the point that my internet connection with the cloud dropped. So now you've got no styling, but you can see the point that the values now come straight through in that string interpolation syntax through to the view from the view model. So kind of any other questions on data binding? Yeah.
Where you just did that string interpolation binding.
Yes.
How would you make that two-way? So on that H1 you just said my heading.
So, well, you couldn't do that on a H1 because there's no way of basically. Well, that's a good point. You couldn't use the two-way syntax on something that doesn't actually take input. So I guess.
Could you not do it? Say if that heading was like the first row in the table, and that was your H1, the name of the first row in the table. Could you not bind that to that?
Yeah, I think you could. So we could try it.
Does it bind on events? Is that how it works? Rather than this looping Angular method, is it an event-based system?
So it doesn't do events. It basically has a set of different strategies that it uses based on the input element that you're using. They've got that kind of a breakdown of that in the docs. I'm not sure what strategies they use for each one, but they basically, the only time that they need to do dirty checking is when you're doing like a calculated property for the most part. There may be some other cases, but yeah, for the most part, yeah, they can kind of avoid it, which is quite nice.
So why would you need to do that, the calculated property?
So say I had so I'll get back to the two-way data binding on heading in a sec. So say I had a property, so that's the first part of the calculated property. And that's the second part. So then I'm going to do like a property, and then this dot so that's the kind of thing where you do a calculated property. This is like a contrived example because we've got both of them here. But say we were stamping out a bunch of contacts, and each of those contacts had a first name property and a second name property. In that case, you might want a calculated property on that view model, which was a concatenation of the first name and the last name. So those are the kind of reasons why you might want a calculated property.
Sure, but why would that cause you a problem?
Oh, why would you? So basically, those values could be changed at any point in the background, and there's no event or anything that gets fired when they get changed.
But there are a limited number of events which can create changes of any kind. Inputs, timers, etc. But you only have to check when one of those events fires.
Yeah, so they've got strategies for certain types of events, like when an input element changes and things like that. But there's no strategy out of the box for calculated properties. In that case, you'd have to resort to like a dependency property instead. Apart from, I can't really go into it in more depth than that, but there is a really good blog post by Rob Eisenberg that goes into that point in a lot more detail as to why, as to kind of which binding strategies get used at which points, and what the performance implications are of that. So yeah, and the next question was two-way data binding on a heading property.
I'm hoping you can just write like text.bind.
Well,
in HTML.bind.
so if we go, I'm not going to try this because I'm not quite sure of the syntax off the top of my head. I'm thinking you can probably do it, but that'd be something to test and tweet to me later to see if that actually works, or I might try it later. Generally, if you think something should probably work, it generally does with Aurelia is the thing. So you can you basically, my kind of way of working is I give it a go and then check the docs later if I need to. But most of the time, things just kind of work, which is quite nice. Any other questions on binding related stuff before we go into? Yep.
What's that app bindable thing in the code behind, in the JS?
Ah.
I've not
Okay.
seen that before. That means
Yeah.
something.
So technically, this is basically what you can do to specify that explicitly that a property is bindable. You only need to do it in custom attributes and custom elements, I think. So
is
in
that-
this case,
is that just an ECMAScript 2016 thing, or is that?
this is an Aurelia attribute. So so I'll go through this part of the file, which will kind of make that a bit more clear. So up in here, we're basically importing a couple of modules from the Aurelia framework. We're importing the inject module, which is going to allow us to do dependency injection, so think like autofac, that kind of thing, or similar with what you've got with Angular, and the bindable attribute that's coming from the Aurelia framework. So this is it's an ES7 decorator, but it is provided as a part of the Aurelia framework as from that import. So there's kind of a lot of these attributes that you're going to see throughout. I typically only use the inject attribute and the bindable attribute on a day-to-day basis, but there are others like the no view attribute like I mentioned before, means that you don't need to have a view associated with that view model. So it's kind of a way that you can do aspect-oriented programming on your kind of view models in a way. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, I didn't know you
Yeah.
could get attributes in JavaScript.
Yeah, so it's ES7 stuff. Yeah, so
I've got a couple of links for the decorator stuff if you want me to post them onto the thing when I get home.
Yeah.
Just for yourself.
Something on Twitter, yeah.
yeah, I'd be interested in seeing those too.
I have a question about the binding. I'm sorry, I was out of the room, so if you have covered this, I do
Yeah,
apologise.
cool.
Object.observe was what the main basis of the two-way binding was actually based on. However, that got scrapped in December. And I understand that from looking at a post on GitHub that Rob Eisenberg actually says like, oh, well, just make it more efficient for the actual, essentially, dirty testing of objects, which is what Angular 1 did. Do you know where they're actually moving with that from your working with it at the moment, or is it just basically that's what they're doing?
Yeah, so I think that's basically what they're doing for the cases where you need dirty checking. Most of the time, you shouldn't need it though. It's only kind of on say calculated properties, or there's a few cases where you would need that, but on standard kind of input elements, they don't need to do that anyway. So it's only if you're kind of binding to a kind of like a calculated property or something like that, as far as I know. But I think the other side of that is they are making work, they are doing work to make that dirty checking a lot more efficient. So it's already more efficient than the dirty checking that was done in Angular 1, and I think they're doing work to improve that.
Well, Angular 1 put in the whole digest system just for that one thing,
Yeah.
which was a pain. So that's quite cool. It's all right. That was just one of the fears because I've tried using this. I know Marvin's done quite a lot. Gentlemen done that. But that was the one thing that's like made me think: is it possible just not to have that and just use one-way binding in this, like you would in React or Angular 2? Can you just use it like that? That was the reason I was asking.
Yeah. You can get away with doing one-way data binding most of the time. I think probably 80% of the time. So you can kind of, that React kind of has this idea of like one-way data flow. So instead of having these two-way data bindings, which can kind of be inefficient for those reasons, because we don't have object.observe, which would kind of notify us when these things are changing. React basically says, well, don't do two-way data binding, just send the data down one way. But when the dev teams are kind of questioned on it, they say, well, there's maybe one or two cases where you still need to kind of have some approach to doing that. So and same with the Angular 2 team, like one of the reasons why Rob Eisenberg left the team was because they were kind of refusing at that point to put in two-way data binding. So he kind of said, well, we should have it because there's these few kind of niche cases where it's really handy to be able to do it.
Well, they've sort of added it now as an optional extra, so therefore you don't get any of it unless you actually ask for it extra, which is the ng model thing.
Oh, is that with Angular 2?
Yeah,
right.
For the plugin for that. So, and React does it in a completely different way. It just says you have to go for a plugin thing, but in reality, they're almost forcing you to do the unidirectional thing with that. It's just a different way of doing it. I just thought
Yeah, exactly. And so with Aurelia, I think you still have that issue, but with Aurelia, it's kind of being upfront at the start and saying there are going to be these few cases where it's really handy to be able to do two-way data binding. Since that's the case, let's make it easy enough for us to do that, and also make the process efficient enough that it's not going to kind of bite you when you do it. So I think it's kind of a shame that the spec kind of got canned for doing the object.observe stuff, which would have made that a lot easier to implement. But I guess they got to work with what they got. So is that kind of
So it covers what I wanted to know. The object.observe stuff, I think they was thinking of canning it because the Angular stuff was coming out. If they'd have realised, I think that Aurelia might have been one of the main contenders. I think that there's three ways you're going at the moment. It's like Angular 2, you've got React, and then you've got this.
I agree. And it's similar with Ember. I think Ember's like another contender now that it was lagging behind a bit, but then they introduced the Glimmer engine, which is basically like a implementation of the efficient virtual DOM stuff that React is doing. So I think all the frameworks are moving in a similar way. The other frameworks kind of try and push you away from doing two-way data binding, whereas Aurelia basically says you can do it. It might be handy to do it in these few cases. You might incur a bit of a performance cost when you do it, but it is handy to be able to do. So, and they do make it efficient where they can. So in the case of input elements and things like that, they've got strategies to make that nice and fast. So does that?
We've got pizza, I think.
Okay, awesome. I'll break there. Okay. Are we ready to get going again?
Yeah.
Yep. Awesome. Okay. Cool. So hopefully you're not all too drowsy after the beer and pizza, but we'll see how many people are still awake after the next kind of 10-20 minutes. It's always hard after like a long day of work as well, because like people aren't, they'll kind of find it hard to focus. I know I do anyway. Okay, so we'll jump back into the presentation, and looks pretty good. So you've seen views and view models. One of the other parts of Aurelia is the singleton. So an Aurelia singleton is nothing more than just a plain JavaScript class. The difference is basically anything that's not, everything that's not a view model is pretty much a singleton, and it's similar to if you've used Angular before, it's like a service or a factory in Angular. With Aurelia, you basically create a class. You can then inject that class into a view model. You then, by default, get only one instance of that, which is shared around your app. If you need one instance per view model, you can override the convention and use that as a specific case. But I found I haven't needed to actually do that. I've been fine just basically treating all my classes as singletons, and it's nice to be able to share them around and not kind of be newing up lots of more objects all the time. So I think we've seen that Aurelia has a pretty consistent binding syntax. So with anything, any basically HTML attribute, you can just go .bind and set up a one-way data binding to it. If it's an input element, it will automatically do a two-way data binding for you. And if you got this string interpolation syntax here, it's going to do an auto one-way data binding for you to render that out to the view.
Can you bind classes?
Yes, you can. So that's something that I find is like really valuable for displaying. This is something, not that.
Sorry.
While we're still on this page, because that's just going to confuse people, we could say have a binding here. If we put the string interpolation syntax inside that class there, we could bind it to say show a different, I use it a lot for when I'm rendering out a lot of different elements into a table, and then I want different colors based on status or different icons or things like that. Then I'll basically do a string interpolation binding on the class, but you can also do a class.bind as well. It's just not as nice a syntax, so I tend to use the string interpolation syntax wherever I can, because it's just kind of, I find it a bit easier to work with.
Was that how that to-do app was crossing out the completed as a binding a class in there?
Yeah, so that was basically binding a class.
No need for jQuery then, basically. You get around the need for jQuery by just binding a class that way.
Yeah, exactly. And kind of, I'll go through that in a little bit, but kind of there's a lot of ways in Aurelia that you can kind of get away from needing to use jQuery or interact with the DOM directly. And so we'll go through those in a little bit as well. Okay, so Aurelia component lifecycle. Okay, now we're in the right spot for that. This is something that is kind of good to be aware of when you start using Aurelia. So there's basically a page lifecycle, and it's kind of like, if any of you did web forms in the past, it's kind of like the page lifecycle that we had for that, but not crap. Basically, it's really simple. There's only really 3 states that you need to be aware of. Activate, which gets fired when you navigate to a view. So if you're using the router, if you've got the router set up, you're navigating to a particular view. When you do that, the activate method will be called on the view model, and you'll be passed the parameters, any parameters that you specified on that route. So what I'll often do is have, in my view model, I'll have a particular route set up to point to a view model. I'll pass in something like an ID. In the onActivate method, I'll then go and use like go and fetch something from a web API and then bind it so that it's shown in the view. So that's kind of the first thing that will happen. Bind is fired basically when you've got a custom element, which we'll go into in a little bit, or a dynamically composed in kind of view model that you're composing into your UI. That's fired when that view or when that component is actually bound, and that's when you basically handle any kind of state that you want to do on a component load. Attach is what you're going to do when you've got anything that's doing DOM interaction. So say you've got a third-party jQuery library. What you would do there is you could fire anything, fire off, say, the jQuery method in the attach to basically do the DOM manipulation. And then on the detach method, that's where you'll basically go and do any cleanup with any jQuery elements. So basically, so that's the kind of left-hand side of it. The right-hand side of it is very important. For the first month, I wasn't kind of looking at these. So I had a whole bunch of timers and things like that were getting left around when I was navigating away from things and things weren't being cleaned up properly. So you've got to kind of make sure that if you have these on the left, you probably should have the corresponding one on the right to basically clean up whatever you're doing on this side. Some things you're not going to need to clean up, but things like particularly timers or subscriptions. Subscriptions are a way that you can basically watch for something changing on the view model and then do something like show a notification or change something in the view. So that kind of stuff, it's useful to know, and that's one of the things that I tended to refer back to the documentation on a lot at the start, just to kind of get my head around what fired when. Because this is a primarily .NET crowd, I often get the question of, when I'm at .NET user groups, of how well does it play with the Microsoft stack? The question is, the answer is actually yes, it plays pretty well. So there's a sample that you can get from the Aurelia, or there's basically a little bootstrap, as in startup application. Too many overloaded terms in web development. But basically there's a little startup application that comes with a Visual Studio solution file. So that has everything you need to get started with Visual Studio. So the way that I primarily work is with VS Code. You see me doing today, just because you don't really need Visual Studio when you're just doing pure JavaScript stuff. But if you're doing a lot of development where you've perhaps got, say, a web API and the JavaScript in the same solution, then Visual Studio can be quite a nice way of working with it. And I won't go into Visual Studio because it would take the rest of the presentation for it to load. Yep.
I was just going to say, it's like it started to integrate Salsa, which was the VS Code JavaScript engine, into the Visual Studio because it was crap before that.
Oh, right.
And it took a long time to be able to work out. It was great, but it was slow.
Yeah.
At least now you get the same experience if you work with VS Code as if you're working with Visual Studio.
That's actually, that's really good. It's good that they're kind of bringing back any kind of innovations that are made in VS Code into Visual Studio itself, because, why have one thing languish? They're both good tools. They're both good for different things. But VS has a lot of room for improvement in some areas, performance being one of them. Okay, router. I don't have a lot of time to go into this in a huge amount of detail, but what you see here is basic convention of route, module, and then any extra metadata. This second route here is when the user navigates to contact/ID, it's going to look for a module called, a view model, one of those exported classes, called contact detail. It's then going to basically load up that, it's going to change the route. It's going to load up that view model and the corresponding view. And then we have a name. You can specify things like the title, so that that kind of automatically updates the page title when they navigate. One of the things that's really handy about the Aurelia router is that you can kind of you can do things like add attributes to these, or there's certain built-in attributes like whether it's a part of the nav. So if I use a nav equals true or nav colon true there on that line, that would mean that when I'm iterating over that, iterating over those routes in a, say, a nav bar up the top, you can basically decide based on code what routes should be shown in the nav bar and which shouldn't. I know in Angular, basically all of that, the way that I was doing it at that point in time was hard-coded. So this means that basically the only thing you need to do to decide whether something's shown in the navigation or not is basically add an attribute here. So it makes it just a lot more dynamic and kind of easy to work with.
Does the Aurelia router support anything other than the hash on the end of the URL?
I'm currently using the hash. I imagine that that wouldn't be the only thing that's supported, but I haven't played with the other option yet myself.
You don't use the hash.
Pardon?
You don't, we don't use the hash.
Right.
But you need an IIS module for IIS to be able to forward all those URL paths to Aurelia or to random.
Okay.
So IIS can't do it natively, but as a Microsoft module, you can install that. Actually, write like a line in your web console to forward all
So basically, anything beyond this URL,
Yeah.
forward it all back to
index .html.
Yeah, and then it picks it up from there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Same thing.
So the web isn't broken.
You back that works.
Yeah. So yeah, well, your back button still works if you're using the hash, but it's not as pretty. So yeah, no, that's a really good point. Is that you'd need a module within IIS, I think, to do that. So I haven't kind of played with it. We're using it for kind of internal apps at the moment, so not too concerned with how pretty the URLs are. It's more getting an app kind of that's functioning out there pretty quickly so that people can get their jobs done. So the hash syntax works okay for that. If I was doing an external app, definitely the clean kind of URLs are really important. Particularly, people are kind of getting to expect that these days. So that's a really good thing to be aware of. Okay, so this is the activate method that I was telling you about before in the page lifecycle. So this is going to get fired in that example there. When the user navigates to that contacts route, on the contact view model, the activate method will be called. We'll then use the HTTP fetch library. This is something that's like coming in browsers. There's currently a polyfill for it that you can use, but basically it's a replacement for the XML HTTP request. So it's a lot cleaner way of actually working with it. Aurelia has two HTTP libraries. It has HTTP client and the HTTP fetch client. Primarily, I just use the HTTP fetch client, and that will work for kind of 90% of your use cases. I don't think I've had to use the alternative HTTP client yet. But in this example, we're basically doing a fetch to the user's route on our back end. In that case, it's one of the Aurelia examples, so it's just coming from a static JSON file. Then basically pushing that, interpreting the JSON, and then pushing that into the user's property on this particular singleton. So, or view model in this case. So that's kind of the basics of how we pull something from the back end and then set it to display on the UI. Typically, I do this through. In this example, it's done directly in the singleton. Directly in the view model. Typically, I'd have a singleton in place, like a contact service or something like that, which would just be a standard JavaScript class that would handle this fetching and then basically returning it back to the view model for display. So it's pretty kind of standard stuff. Is there any questions on how that works or comments? Cleaner than XML HTTP response? Basically, most people are probably doing this with something like the Angular request or the built-in one with jQuery or something like that. this just starts putting it into like a standard way of doing it. Okay, so value converters. So value converters are basically a way of changing taking a value on the property, a value in a property on a view model, and changing the way that it's displayed for output, or vice versa, changing the way that it's interpreted for input. So in this case, we've got a value converter, which is basically taking the date property and basically converting it into like a clean date format using the moment library. So this is really simple. You basically use this pipe syntax to say, take this date, convert it, and push it out as whatever the result of this function is. And so it starts off really simple, being able to do these kind of things, but value converters are actually a really kind of powerful piece of the framework. This is how you'll implement things like sorting or filtering on a table. The table that I had on the to-do list example earlier was using value converters to basically take the value that is in each of those rows, run it through the function in the to view to basically decide whether that row should be shown or not. So it starts off really simple, but this is what actually allows you to get kind of a lot more of those complex UI functions working. So these are things that you would typically do with a filter in Angular. At the moment, there's not a lot of these built in. One of the things that I think we'll see coming soon with Aurelia is a lot more of these value converters kind of built into the framework. At the moment, you have to write all of these yourself. And so that's one of the things, because it's kind of in RC, they haven't filled all of these gaps yet. But it's pretty powerful, and it'll be good once they get more in the framework itself.
Is that convention that's based on that previous one? You just stick value converter after whatever it is?
So,
or is that to say you've named it?
Yeah, so that's basically a convention there like with most of the things that are in Aurelia, simple conventions, and it also makes things kind of easier to follow. If you kind of follow these conventions, then you can clearly see when you open up that class that it is a value converter. So it's quite handy like that.
You change them conventions?
Yes, you can. So basically every convention in the Aurelia framework can be overridden, and it's typically done with those decorators. So if I can find an example. I have to go back a bit far to find an example, but one of the easy examples that we saw earlier is the no view decorator, which basically said the typical convention for Aurelia is to look for a corresponding .html file corresponding to every .js file with the same name. So when we use the no view decorator, that's basically overriding that convention to say, in this case, we don't want a view to be displayed, so don't go looking for one. If we didn't do that, then it would Aurelia would give us an error to say, I can't find that view. So yeah, I think typically from what I've been experiencing so far, 80% of the time you can just work with the out-of-the-box conventions, and then 20% of the time, if that, you might want to change them. But it depends on how kind of custom your workflow is. So moving on to the last few bits and pieces for wrap-up. When it comes time to do the release, so when you start off with the sample project, it's going to be doing a lot of requests, like hundreds and hundreds of requests when you initially load the app, which is really slow. So that's okay for development time, but when you actually go to push that into production, you don't want to do that because users are going to just hate you for it. And so what you can do is just basically bundle everything Aurelia has a CLI, tool to basically allow you to do that. But you can also do it as a part of the Gulp build. So that's basically what I'm doing. I've just got a bundle task set up in my Gulp build to basically push everything into a single file. You end up with about 8 files being downloaded roughly when the Aurelia app loads, rather than like hundreds. So it's definitely definitely a lot better. But eventually, hopefully, we shouldn't need to bundle once HTTP2 becomes more prevalent. We'll have multiplexing, so we'll be able to request a lot more things at the same time. So then we won't need to bundle necessarily. We'll be able to just request the scripts as we need them. But for now, bundling is kind of what we have to do. Okay, so two-way data binding or unidirectional data flow. So this is your question from a bit earlier.
With the bundling thing, I had a look at JSPM, which obviously is what this tends to work off. You don't have to use it, but it tends to bundle all. It's either you have total lazy loading, or you have just you take the whole bundle. Now, say for instance you have an admin panel in your SPA and you have a non-admin panel. That means you could have 5 megabytes worth of JavaScript coming down. It is possible to split it, but it is very, very difficult. HTTP2 really is quite close. So there should be sort of like a middle ground. Is there not a possibility of middle ground in this?
So I don't think so with JSPM. You have the option of using Webpack as well. So I think that would probably be the other option. I haven't used Webpack myself, but I assume, I don't know if you've got experience with that, whether you can split it up into kind of sub-bundles.
You can. It's very config heavy.
Right.
So JSPM is the fact that it works one way or the other, and it works very quick. Webpack is the fact that you have to declare everything. But then again, if you're sort of mixing everything together and you want to actually lazy load everything, in theory you have to. So
exactly.
You either take one world or the other. Depends on what you're actually developing for.
Yeah. So for our case, it doesn't really matter at this stage because it's a fairly small and new app. I think it would become an issue when you've got kind of a huge app, lots of different files that you're bundling together. Then you've potentially got a big load time up front for users, but that's typically the case with a lot of single-page apps these days. So start seeing these things where loading bars as the app's kind of being downloaded and initialized and things like that. But yeah, it's the answer is you pretty much have to choose one or the other for now, which is it's not ideal, but
I did see an article by I can't remember the gentleman's name at this precise moment. We literally only about 3 hours ago, so it might be rubbish. But he said like the modern version of JSPM is literally moving on so quickly. You can't take the newest version, but you can actually export into individual bundles in a similar sort of way to what you can with Webpack. So it technically is possible, but
it's probably very cutting edge, and it'll be probably a while before the Aurelia tooling kind of catches up with it as well. At the moment they're doing a lot of experiments. JSPM also has some issues with speed at the moment because it's quite new. So there are a few performance issues with the initial load time of JSPM. So as an alternative, there's Webpack, which is really fast by comparison, from what I've read anyway. So you've got those kind of few options. I think all of this stuff is very new, so it's changing very fast, and it's a matter of just kind of keeping up to speed with what's going on. I think we will get solutions for it probably in the near future, I'd say. So we went through a bit of this stuff on unidirectional data flow, but I'll kind of jump past that and kind of move to the important stuff. So browser support, evergreen browsers. Initially, it only supported evergreen browsers, but the team went and looked at it and said, well, with a little bit of effort, we can basically back support like IE9 and IE10 with using a few polyfills and things like that to fill in the gaps. So it does support back to those browsers, and that's probably good enough for most cases these days. Hopefully, don't need to support IE8, but if you do, you're not in. You're kind of out of luck with Aurelia. 2 months in, so this slide is a little bit out of date. So we're now about 4 months in, but still kind of similar. So it's still very new. It's still in RC. Documentation is better than it was. They've actually got proper documentation now, but it's still not where it should be and where the team wants to get it. So they're actively working on that at the moment. And also, as I mentioned, lack of third-party tools. So there's not much that's going to come for you that's kind of built by the Aurelia team that you can just kind of drop in apart from the core framework. Things like bootstrap components and things like that you would just be able to pull in something like Angular just don't exist for Aurelia yet. The good thing about Aurelia, though, how it kind of gets around that is that it's really compatible with just plain old JavaScript. So it's easy to kind of pull in standard either jQuery libraries or third-party JavaScript libraries and kind of create your own custom elements or attributes using those. So that's what I've had to do to kind of fill in a lot of the gaps with the framework over the past kind of few months getting started. So easiest way to get started, either there's a sample that you can download directly from the Aurelia site, or if you use Yeoman, you can just npm install Yeoman if you don't have it, and then Yo Aurelia will get you a basic application with the gulp tasks and everything that you need to get going. So that's probably the easiest way to get going. There's a lot of dependencies, so it might take a while to download everything it needs, but that's the most basic and simple way to kind of get started. So that's it. That's me. A lot of what I've talked about today is on my blog, and you can ping me on Twitter or email if you've got any questions. Always like to talk about this kind of stuff, so feel free to get in touch. Cool.
Has anyone got any questions they want to fire at Sean now?
I got one.
Yeah.
Which part of Oz are you from?
Melbourne.
I've been to Melbourne actually last month.
Cool. Yeah.
Why did you leave?
I ask myself.
Couldn't stand the weather anymore.
Black widow spiders. They're moving over there. It's such a beautiful city. Which part of Melbourne are you living in?
So I was living out in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. Yeah, so out in the Dandenong Ranges, quite nice. But the funny thing was, every time I'd come to England in the past, it was in the summer. So I had this kind of false.
It was a Wednesday, I think.
It's like that brief 2-week period where there's actually sun. So I had this false conception that there was actually decent weather. So yeah, I've kind of been through the first winter now, and it was a bit of a struggle.
We have lovely people, but we have absolutely awful weather.
Yeah,
We just had
definitely.
snow outside today as well.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was snowing over there.
Yeah, it was snowing down in Worcester last week as well. Just randomly, in the morning it was snowing for about half an hour, and then all of a sudden in the afternoon it broke out into sun, so who knows what's going on.
Can you answer that honestly? What do you think about coffee over here?
The coffee? Yeah.
No, you have to try coffee in Melbourne. It's absolutely amazing.
Yeah, the coffee over here is not as good. I think it's getting better. Yeah.
Just make sure you don't go to Starbucks. That's the best thing to do. Just don't go to Starbucks.
Yeah, that's pretty much wherever you go in the world, Starbucks is a bad choice.
I
Yeah.
don't know if this is appropriate, but I have a tech question.
Yeah. No tech questions here. Only travel related.
Enjoying TypeScript and that kind of stuff. Is there anything in this that should persuade me to invest my time in this rather than that?
Yeah, so the main things that differentiate Aurelia from Angular 2 is just kind of the really clean syntax. and kind of focus on conventions. So typically with Aurelia, you need to write a lot less code to get kind of the same result. And that's kind of Rob Eisenberg's focus, is making a really developer-friendly framework. The Angular team wants to make a really good, well, this is just my personal opinion, but it seems like the Angular 2 focuses on making a really powerful framework that does everything that they think developers need, but not necessarily in a way that is easiest to consume from all kinds of developers. So Aurelia just makes it a lot easier, particularly getting started, but also because there's a lot less involvement of the framework there, you should be able to kind of port, if you want to port away from Aurelia at some point, or if you want to even bring some parts of another app into Aurelia, it should be easier because there's less kind of framework code that you'd have to write specifically for that framework. Performance, the current benchmarks show Aurelia as about, I think, 2x the performance of Angular, but it changes all the time, so that may not be the case for very long.
What about compared to React?
React,
which is a completely different rendering engine, but...
Yeah, so I think on the performance side of things, Aurelia is about 2x React at the moment on the rendering side of things, on the latest benchmarks that I've seen. On the framework side of things, Aurelia is... So React is more of like a view engine, whereas Aurelia is like a fully fledged framework.
Sorry, I meant Flux rather than just React. So, yeah,
React with Flux,
they do completely different things. From my experience of using React, it's very much like they describe it as like the Doom 3 engine, the fact that we just basically take what you think is different to what you had before and we'll just render it out.
Yeah.
Whereas like Angular 2 and what I can see, Aurelia looks great. Looks like the fact that you are actually just manipulating individual parts of the DOM. So you're not looking at it as like, well, we're just going to change everything where we think it is. We're going to actually just be pinpoint with the front end. Yeah, so basically the way that Aurelia achieves the performance is slightly different. So React uses the virtual DOM. So you basically update the virtual DOM, which is basically an in-memory representation of the DOM. So you make a lot of changes to that. And then at the point, React basically figures out the most efficient way to update the actual DOM based on the virtual DOM and does it for you. So that's how they achieve that kind of performance. And Ember does it the same way, whereas Aurelia uses something that's kind of a hidden browser feature called microtasks. So they basically push everything into the microtask queue, batch it up, and then basically push everything as kind of one update. So they're able to achieve basically the same performance as what React do, but just in a slightly different way. Yeah, does that kind of... No, it is exactly what I thought.
Yeah.
It's good to hear someone that's used it that says the same.
Yeah, so I haven't used React myself, but from the experience I've had with Aurelia, I haven't run into any issues where I'm like, the page is running really kind of slow due to DOM manipulation.
Have you had to do massive amounts of tabular data?
Yes.
Did it work well?
Yes, it wasn't slow. So we've had up to, probably not thousands, but maybe like 800 kind of rows in a table with, value converters running kind of manipulation on all of them. And it's snappy. At least on the PCs that we've tested it with. So, so we haven't run into any issues with like huge tables or anything in our testing.
That's the real important thing, isn't it? So.
Yeah, exactly. The benchmarks are only like a specific use case, rendering a particular thing like loads and loads of times. But what's really important is how it feels for users. And
perception is more important than anything else.
Exactly. And the perception has been so far that there's been no issue with it with Aurelia, really. Any other questions?
Well, one thing to add to one of your slides, I know that it's far and wide, and you won't possibly able to cover it all, but on the activate of that page, there's a couple of nice things that come with it, which one of them, Angular, with the ng cloak and classes to hide the fooch, Aurelia just does away with that, and one of the behaviors behind the activate is that it waits for, say, it detects a fetch or a HTTP get, and it will wait till it's got the data before it does the binding. So really nice things that they're doing to. And there's a little loading widget in the top right corner and the bar that comes across.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
can turn all that sorts of thing off, but
Yeah, you can basically just hook into when it's loading and automatically show that kind of loading state. And those kind of things that were always a pain to do with, at least with Angular 1, and you had to do a lot of your own code to get that working.
you use
Just
the
kind of,
CSS to hide the page and into your code. It's like
yeah, absolutely, and it just kind of works out of the box. So it's kind of, that's what I mean by it being like a really developer-friendly framework, is they've taken all those things that are kind of standard but kind of a pain to do and made them kind of work really nicely out of the box. So yeah, so from a developer standpoint, and you know, it is really easy to get started with that stuff. You know, like you said, there's a lot of stuff that I haven't covered today. I was only able to kind of just scratch the surface. So there's a lot more. I'd recommend, if anyone's got Pluralsight subscriptions, I'd recommend their course by, I think, Scott Allen on Pluralsight is really good. He covers like basically the the main parts of what the framework can do. And there's a book on the way as well. It's about 60% done, I think. I think there's another couple of Pluralsight courses coming as well. So there's resources coming for it. A few months ago, that wasn't the case. You pretty much had to check the GitHub issues and things like that to see what was going on. But it's getting a lot more. Yeah, there's a lot more information out now than there was. So yeah,
Cool. Cheers. Yeah, thanks to Sean for coming. Got a quick question for if anybody wants to win a JetBrains license. Earlier on, Sean was saying about we've shown us this attribute and it was at binding something. What version of JavaScript did you say it was coming in? You can have a free JetBrains license.
ESM.
Wait,
Yeah,
man, he's got it, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And next month we've got lightning talks. We've only got 2 speakers so far, so we need another 2 speakers. It's just talking about a subject you want to talk about for about 15 minutes and then about 5 minutes worth of questions. So if you've got something you want to share with everybody else, please let me know, because we need to fill 2 of the spots.
It doesn't have to be .NET.
Yeah.
.NET
JavaScript.
but it doesn't
Do
have to.
JavaScript. We don't get enough JavaScript. Yes, if anyone's got to talk, please let me know. And finally, thanks to the people who give us this building, that's Capital One, and thanks to Cordius, who've gone. They want to buy the pizza and beer.
Yes, thanks to Rebel. Yeah.
Cheers.